So now that we've got the sled removed, we're ready to cut the rest of our strips. And it's very important that these strips match the old strips as closely as possible. So what I did was simply took one of the strips that I'd already cut, kind of sandwiched it in between the blade and the fence, brought the fence up, locked it down, and made some test cuts. Now remember, we're shooting for 7/8 of an inch, which is 0.875. So 876 is definitely within an acceptable range. So here's one of the test pieces that I cut, and that is close enough for me. That is dead on. So, and the reason we want to be so picky about this is when we finally go to glue these pieces together, I mean, no matter how hard we try, there's going to be some deviation between them, and that's just the way it is. So, I mean, sanding is just a necessary evil. But what we want to do is keep it to as minimal as possible. Remember, we're dealing with end grain, but we're also dealing with some very hard woods here. So the end grain is going to be especially tough. So every step that we take to get it as level and as flat as possible is really going to save us some time down the road. So now that all our pieces are cross-cut, you have a decision to make. If you like this pattern, it's very easy just to turn all the pieces 90 degrees, glue it back together. You still have the same pattern, but you have an end grain cutting board. Let's see what that looks like. Now, while that's still a good looking cutting board and it is now end grain, I think I still prefer it with the staggered look. So let's see how that's done. Yeah, I think I like this pattern much better. Hope you guys agree. So let's take it over to the workbench and start gluing it together. So the gluing strategy on this is fairly straightforward. What I'm doing is gluing 4 pieces at a time. Trying to glue this entire board at one time is basically a losing proposition. The pieces want to slip past one another, especially when they get glue on them. They also don't seat at the same level. So again, that would be more sanding, which we're really trying to avoid because this is end grain. So I'm doing 4 at a time, and the process here is basically to lay 3 of them down. Don't put glue on this one. Spread the glue. I'll use a brush and spread it, and then turn each piece back up, sandwich it together. So what I've done is actually only put glue on one side. Now on my segmented turnings, I do put glue on both sides, and that's because you're gluing mostly end grain together. The end grain really wicks up the glue. This, we're dealing with a long grain to long grain connection, which is a very strong joint. So having glue only on one side is sufficient for this type of joint. So once the glue is put on, we will put some cauls on either side to evenly distribute the pressure. I'm going to add 3 clamps. I've got a stack of cauls back here. Once I start adding clamps, I will take my little mallet here and just make sure everything is seated as flat as possible. Set it aside and move on to the next one. And once that's done, we'll start grouping the groups of 4 together into 8 and eventually wind up with our complete board. Okay, 5 more to go. So after giving the assemblies a few hours to dry, I am now left with 6 groupings of 4. And the original plan was to then glue those into, sections of 2. That way I'd have 3 and then glue the whole thing together. I think I'm going to bypass that now and actually glue them all together at once. And the reason I'm choosing to do that is now that these are wider, they're less likely to want to rock and kind of slip out of alignment. Another reason is, as you can tell, I've switched to pipe clamps as opposed to bar clamps. Now, even though I do have some 24-inch bar clamps, which would be long enough, if these clamps are tilted a little bit, when you go to tighten them, then they do want to pull your pieces out of alignment. Whereas you have a pipe clamp, the pad is much wider and you can tell much easier if you are clamping it square and keeps it in line. Also, the rotational forces as you turn does want to kind of twist the pieces and torque them up or down. These clamps, of course, press straight in. So now that I've switched to this style of clamp, I feel more confident that I'm going to get a nice square glue up the entire way. You can also see I've added some triangles here, and that's because I did have to touch up the edges just with the sander, just very lightly, to get them nice and true again. There was a little variation after they came out of the clamps, actually. So after touching them up, I just worked at one group at a time, made a triangle, and just kept working my way towards the end until I had them all done. And so now we're actually ready to start gluing. So, just as before, we're only going to apply glue to one side. Again, we're dealing with a long grain joint here. So, I'm going to stack the first 5 of them, turn them up on edge, apply glue, spread it with the brush, and unstack them in sequence and glue them back together. So, you can also see that I added some masking tape here, and that's because, I'm sure you've all experienced it, where the glue will react with the iron that's in the pipes and give that nasty black stain. Now, it's probably not a big deal on the Purple Heart or the walnut, but if it gets on the maple, it will leave a black stain. And again, we're going to be sanding end grain, which is going to be hard enough, and the black tends to stain fairly deeply, so we don't want to have to remove any more material than necessary. So let me show you my gluing sequence here. So you just want to get a little bit of pressure on right now just to kind of hold things, and just kind of eyeball and see if you have a good reveal on either side. That way you know you're square. And you will have to, adjust a piece left or right, and of course your fingers are the best tools for that. They'll tell you instantly if you're lined up or not. And that's good. So try and give it, a little press to make sure everything is seated as well. And then I tighten as evenly as possible so as not to accidentally get something out of line, and just monitor it as well. So give it another quick check. Looks good. And I also like to kind of look underneath as well and just make sure there's no cupping. What you definitely don't want is to apply too much pressure and the pieces basically just cup and actually blow out. So I'll always check the bottom, make sure it's sitting flat, which it is. So, yep, everything looks good. So now we wait.